So those are some of the primary drivers, I would say. What I now want to talk about is some of the outcomes of the food system. And again, I think you will recognise some of these, but hopefully I can add a little bit of extra detail that I want you to try to start to think about. Now, the first is the statement about the degree of issues that we face in terms of our global food system. So we have two quotes here that sum it up. Half of the world's population does not eat a properly nutritious diet, as of analysis in 2017. Almost every country in the world is facing a serious nutritionally related challenge. Almost every country. It doesn't say almost every developing world country or every country classified as poor or medium income. It's almost every country. This is the scale of the problem. And I'd like you just to think for a moment. How is it possible that almost every country has a nutritional crisis? What do you think is going on here? The first thing that probably comes to mind, and that we've probably had on our minds for a while, is the idea of hunger, lack of sufficient nutrition, and that is certainly and continues to be a major problem, as we will look at in a moment. But the second aspect is another form of mal or bad nutrition, and that's the recognition of overnutrition and both the health and social detriment that can come from that, where individuals are overnourished. And indeed, the discourse now is shifting to say, well, actually, it's very reasonable to regard both of these as equally problematic when we're thinking about the Global Sustainable Development Agenda. So let's just dig into this, and we do have some good news. So, as of relatively recent analysis, the incidence of global famine and the intensity of global famine have changed because of the development of our food system under an increasingly financialized capitalist system. And here we've got some empirical data on deaths of individual humans resulting from a lack of food and hunger. And we can see that as we come into the 1970s, the 1980s, when the global interest in development and food, the food agenda really starts to take hold, these figures are greatly reducing, although there's a bit of an uplift around 2010. But generally, this is positive. We would argue this is the right direction to help people have fulfilling lives because they're not dying of a foundational lack of nutrition. But how would you say we are getting on with hunger now? If you had to think about levels of hunger in the world, would you say they are continuing to fall and it's just a matter of time pushing in the right direction? Would you say that this is something that's maybe plateaued and now we're stuck at a certain level, that there are just a certain percentage of the population that we just can't seem to feed appropriately? What do you think? Unfortunately, the news is really upsetting. So, data here from this year. This is from the Food and Agriculture Organization. Sorry, my citation has got cut off. But from 2005 through to about 2015, the general trend in terms of the numbers of undernourished people in the world, as best we had data for, were falling. Unfortunately, as of about 2015, that number has started to increase. The extent of the change now around 2018, 2019 is that we are starting to see a uplift in both the numbers of people who are undernourished and also, as the blue line records, as a percentage of the global population. Now, something that's particularly contemporary to this, the incidence of conflict is a huge problem, and of course, most recently, the global pandemic of COVID-19 has had a significant impact on a lot of food systems to mean that the amount of food produced is reducing or has been compromised as population has continued to grow. So we are categorically failing in our aspiration to be heading towards the Global Sustainable Development Goal of no hunger. Just to put things in numbers for you, so recently the United Nations communicated some of its research. They think that it will be 840 million people by 2030 who are classified as hungry if current trends continue, which is a significant upward rise. Just to dwell on this in a little bit more detail. So yes, there were significant progress made up until 2015, but then things started to change. So from 2015 onwards, it was about 11% of the global population that were classified as undernourished. I'd like just to dwell for a moment on this concept. When you hear the term undernourishment, or that someone is undernourished, what do you take it to mean? Can you just have a little think? Drawing from the literature, so undernourishment is a state in which dietary energy consumption is less than a predetermined national threshold required to conduct sedentary and light activities. Now, I'd like you to just have a look a little bit longer at that definition and to just try to ask some critical questions about it. Are there any concerns that you have that arise from that definition? So my first question would be, well, nationally determined threshold or level sounds like it could be a bit complicated. Maybe countries have different thresholds, and indeed in many cases they do. So maybe this isn't necessarily the best universal picture, because maybe if I was a government choosing my threshold for what counted as undernourishment, I might be inclined to choose a threshold that was lower rather than higher, because that would make me look better, because I could say there are less undernourished people than actually maybe in reality there are. The second aspect that I find particularly concerning around this is that the threshold, even where it is set rigorously and with full ethical commitment to transparency, it's set at a level of nutrition required to conduct sedentary or light activities. Now, sedentary is basically sitting around not doing anything, and light activities. As you know, our world is full of people whose daily lives are characterized not by sedentary and light activities, but by very intense, very energy intensive and very heavy activities. Take being a small farmer yourself. Being a small farmer in a developing world country like Malawi, where I've worked, is incredibly hard physical work. So the idea that you are only undernourished if you're getting enough energy to do very light activities, I think is failing to capture the full extent of the problems that we see in our world. The lack of alignment between nutrition and the daily realities of the needs of people. So there's a serious conceptual problem here. Now, things have changed a little bit since the first quote from 2017. The Food and Agriculture Organization have rethought about the way that they are counting the prevalence of undernourishment in China. And actually, the figures have been revised. So the latest suggestion is that it's about 8.9% of global population that's undernourished. But that still represents the same empirical value of numbers of people that are undernourished. So basically, we need just to retrospectively change our understanding of the past. But yeah, it's around now 8.9% of people. But if we dig into the category of people, and we have a think maybe about children. So again, from the most recent report, so this is data from last year, 2019. So we've got 21.3% of children under 5 years of age are stunted. So their height and their growth is not what would be expected as against the profile of a child who is adequately nourished for expected growth and physical development. So if you think about 21.3%, let's be generous and let's say that's, yeah, let's round it to 20%. Now think about your class size. I'm not quite sure what it's going to be yet, but think about how many people that would mean. 20%. Imagine, translate it back. So 20% of the people you know, if you were a globally representative, would be physically stunted because you hadn't had enough food. 6.9% of your classmates would be what's categorized as wasted. So at a level of kind of body mass index way below a critical threshold. But by the same token, there are 5.6% of people in your class, if you were children of the world, would be overweight. So we are dealing with a situation of abject disadvantage and also great inequality in terms of the way that calories have been distributed between you, meaning that about 6% of you have actually been overnourished, which is a huge problem. Another category worth identifying, I think, is that of women. Because of their reproductive potential, women obviously play a significant role in population change, and it's a significant welfare issue. Data hasn't been updated most recently, but it's still considered to be the case that a third of women who are of reproductive age, taken from the global scale, they suffer from anemia, which means that should they then become pregnant and have children, there is a serious health risk to both them and to the development of their children subsequently. So hunger has a series of impacts way below the surface. If we look at the distribution of the prevalence of hunger from data from 2019, we can probably see patterns that we might expect. So the blue countries have less than 2.5% of their population who would be classified as undernourished, moving again through to the dark red colour. Grey countries are those countries for which there is no data. So we can see here some concerning patterns. Let's start at the top with the blue countries. Even in the richest and most developed countries in the world, there are still people who don't have enough calories for a sedentary or light set of activities on a daily basis. And that has to be a national scandal for those countries, an absolute disgrace as a representation of how supposedly developed these countries are, especially as we will see later, compared with other things. You will see the maybe expected patterns of countries in South America and particularly Africa, where in some cases we are talking about, the sun is shining on my screen. I can't see what the biggest percentage range is, but what I can see is the ones that are 25 to 34%. Yeah, that's the biggest one. 25 to 34.9% of that national population are undernourished. That's just over a third of the population in the most extreme situations. So these are the geographies of hunger as we need to be addressing them today. We can also look at a more short-term need. So this map shows us the numbers of food insecure people who are characterized by global authorities as being in urgent need of action. So this is kind of areas that are either in what will be defined as a famine period or very close to that being the case. And as we can see, in some cases, it is in excess of 2 million people in a country who are in urgent need of nutritional intervention to save them from some sort of crisis state. A lot of these countries are characterized by conflict. So again, it's maybe less to do with the production of food, but it's more about the people's ability to access this food because maybe violent conflict is preventing it. Although, of course, violent conflict can also dramatically undermine food production in the first place. Let's think now about the other side of malnutrition. So this map, data is quite old. I couldn't find anything more recent, unfortunately. But this is a world map of overnutrition. And we can see that the darkest colour here represents in excess of 30% of the national population being classified as overnourished. So this is the prevalence of obesity, and obesity is people who have a body mass index of greater than 30. We can see both North America and Europe have these characteristics, but also we see that South America is quite red in colour, and Africa also has countries that exhibit these characteristics. So the problem we have got, or one of the complexities that we've got, is that even within the same country, there can be significant levels of undernutrition, but also significant levels of overnutrition. And actually, empirical data also shows that when you zoom into a specific family, even within a family household, you can have individuals who are categorically, quantifiably undernourished, and other individuals who are overnourished. And this takes the food system thinking down to a very micro level, thinking about the interactions within those households around food and feeding and nutrition. On the plus side, at the global aggregate level, it's important to say that food production has continued to expand. So the graph on the right-hand side shows us the changes in the tonnage of food production produced from the 60s through to 2012, broken down by geographical area. And we can see that while some countries have plateaued out, so those countries in Europe have plateaued out in terms of their overall food production, production has continued to rise in other parts of the world, including North America. And the green line, as an average, we see that food tonnage continues to expand because of all the factors that we've been talking about in terms of the drivers. If we zoom in on picking cereal production and utilization, so we take data from the most recent Food and Agricultural Organization analysis, we can see here that the orange line across the years represents production, the yellow line is utilization, and therefore the bar graphs show us the food stocks or the food buffers that are available. And obviously we can see that in general production has remained higher than consumption. Although of course we can see, as in 2012-13 and 2018-19, in some cases utilization grows above production, and therefore we start to eat into buffer stocks that are stored in various points around the world. In terms of cereal, I would say this is we are generally looking at a positive situation. So food production continues to expand, and we continue to have a global buffer stock. Although it is important to point out that while the global buffer stock increases quite significantly across some periods of this graph, the most recent trend is a leveling out, and the growth has been smaller. Thinking about how the food system is organized, obviously the price mechanism plays a really significant role in this, and it's something we'll be thinking about. If we look at the new graph, now this is an index of all food prices across all of the world, which is quite a crude headline figure. We can see that as an aggregate, the price of food fluctuates significantly, as we know, and as you will expect, this is balancing out supply and demand. So in a situation in which there is a negative shock to the supply of, let's say, cereal, and production drops, but demand stays high, the price will increase, and therefore incentivize other actors to try to produce to compensate. And obviously the opposite is true, where production way outstrips demand, the price drops, and therefore disincentivizes production. Now, there's a whole series of problems created by price mechanisms around food, which we will explore later in the module. But generally, we could argue that prices have been really important in maintaining the supply of food. But something related that's been hinted at already is that lack of nutrition often doesn't result from a physical absence of food. It is a lack of access to obtain that food. And you may have come across the name of Amartya Sen. He was an economist. he won a Nobel Peace Prize for pointing out that the famines, certain famines that we'd observed in Africa, that people had generally thought were a result of a physical lack of food, he identified actually it was about financial access. And there are many examples of this throughout history. So for those students who might have heard of the episodes of the Irish potato famine, now there's an awful lot of total nonsense that exists in popular understanding of this. Lots of jokes about Irish people and potatoes, but a general belief that an Irish potato famine was a lack of potatoes, and that potatoes were the only thing the Irish people would eat, so it's sort of their fault. The reality of this situation is that there were probably more than enough potatoes to be consumed, and there was more than enough food for Irish people to eat. The reality was that there was too much food getting exported from Ireland to mainland Britain and to England, motivated by financial interests and also a deep level of racism by the British, at exactly the same time as Irish people were suffering from famine and dying of hunger. So this is a very significant example of how access to food is much more important than the physical presence of food. Coming up to date, we still have this exact same situation happening. And if you think it sounds like a moral travesty in the past, I really hope you agree it's a moral travesty in the contemporary situation. So you may have come across the concept of food deserts. So if we look at analysis done in 2016, we can identify particular parts of the United States of America where population is very unlikely to have a car, and there are no supermarkets within a mile. So this means that there is an incredible set of physical and financial barriers to access, particularly to poorer people, just to get any type of food. And then if we start looking into detail about the nutritional quality of that food, we can identify further barriers. So this idea of food access is absolutely key. And we need to think about food access as a multi-dimensional thing, which is why we use food systems approach. So yes, there can be physical issues. Seas are in the way. Roads are no good. Maybe there's a highway built between you and the nearest supermarket, and you can't get there because you haven't got a car, and you can't run across a 6-lane motorway. There are also socially constructed barriers to people accessing food that may well exist. So prices, we've talked about. There's a whole series of politically motivated interventions around trade tariffs and import rules, etc. And we even see examples where the international community or countries might seek to block the access of another country to food in order to achieve a political end. So a whole range of reasons that people will not have access to even the most basic levels of food.